Hello, this is Amin, and you are watching session 12 of ASP.NET Core tutorial. In this session, we are going to talk about ASP.NET Core MVC Routing. If you remember, in session 10 and 11 of this tutorial series, we were talking about MVC and MVC structure, and also we present routing default in MVC. If you haven't watched those sessions, we highly recommend to watch those sessions before proceeding this session. In these two sessions, we go to detail of MVC and MVC structure and MVC architectural design pattern. In this session, as I mentioned, we are going to talk about routing in MVC. If you remember, in the previous session, we add routing default of MVC to our startup class and in respective method. And this is the default routing that we have. In the pattern, you can see controller and action and ID. Controller refer to controller name, and also action refer to action method, and also ID, as you can see, refer to ID, which can be query string. In this default routing, if we don't enter a specific routing and we just enter the domain of our application, by default, it's looking for a home controller and index action inside the home controller, and also ID would be optional. I will explain these routing in detail in this session. And let's flip to Visual Studio and the project that I have been working throughout this tutorial. As you can see, this is the default routing that I have in my startup class and in my endpoint routing. And as you can see, the default controller name is home and default action name is index. And as you can see, I have home controller, and inside home controller, I have index action method. Let's run the project. Before running the project, let me change this action method to a string and convert it to a simple string. Hello from home controller index action. Let me run the project. As you can see, I haven't entered any route in this routing, and by default, I see the message that I entered in the action index action in home controller. And actually, the exact route of this page is domain name and also home controller and index action method. And as you can see, the result is the same as the time that I didn't enter controller name and action name. Let's check if I request for another action method, same as detail, what I will receive. As I expected, I received 404 error because within my project, I don't have detail action inside home controller. Let's add detail action method. And this time I return, let me copy it from here. And paste it here. And this time I mentioned detail action. And let's run the project once more. By default, my project is launching home controller and index action. And this time, let me route to detail action method. As you can see, the detail action method is invoked, and I can see the message that I entered in detail action method. Also, I have ID. Let me receive ID from detail and also continue this string, and its ID is equal ID. Let's run the project once more. And this time I want to go to home and detail. As you can see, I didn't enter any ID, and by default it's 0. And if I enter, for example, 5 as an ID, I will have 5 here as an ID, or if I enter another number, I will have those numbers as an ID in my detail action method. Let's back to the project and back to routing and change the default routing to, for example, cast controller and index action method, and run the project. As expected, as we don't have cast controller and index action within that one, I receive 404 error. Let's create respective controller to my project. One empty controller and call it cast controller, and let me remove this one from end of that one and add the controller to project. And within that one I have index, and let me change the output to a string, and again hello from cast controller index action. And let's run the project once more. This time, as we expect, the project by default run cast controller and index action within cast controller. Let's back to project again and make this one mandatory. If you want to have one query string which would be optional, you should add a question mark to end of your query string. But if I remove it and run the project once more, I receive 404 error because I didn't enter ID in this project. But if I wrote to, for example, cast and index and enter one number as ID, you can see my routing is working, and I again invoke index action within cast controller. But also I can make a default number for this one, 100, and again go to the home and detail action method as a default and run the project once more. As expected, without entering any URL except domain name, I'm going to home controller and detail action method, and ID by default is 100. Let me back it to default. Also, for example, if you want to have one prefix before your home controller, you can add your prefix, for example, my app equal my app. And let's run the project. This time, if I want to go to, for example, cost index, if I don't enter the prefix, I receive 404 page. For solving this issue, I should enter prefix as well to complete the routing and invoke the proper action within the selected controller. But for most of the cases, these default routing handle the MVC purpose, and by default it can be any controller that you want, and also you can invoke any prefix index that you want to run as a start of your project. And I hope this explanation clear the routing in MVC for yourself, and also in the coming videos we will go to detail of controller views and models. Thank you for watching this session, and don't forget to follow us on our social media channels, and also you can see the playlist of this video series in description of this video, as well as a link of text version of this video. Thank you for watching.